Final score for a moment, because the real mystery may have been hiding inside the whistles. Every questionable call seemed to arrive at just the right or wrong moment, and before long, Caitlin Clark fans were connecting one decision to another. Then, Angel Reese and the Atlanta Dream became part of the equation, making the entire situation even stranger. So, was this simply bad officiating, or was something else happening behind the scenes? The game itself was already chaotic before the controversial sequence arrived. Indiana and Atlanta went into Sunday's matchup with plenty at stake, and the Fever eventually escaped with a 95-91 overtime victory. Caitlin Clark finished with 26 points and 9 assists, while Angel Reese had 15 points, 14 rebounds, and 6 assists for Atlanta. But if you only look at the final score, you miss the part of this game that has people talking about the officials. Because there was a moment when it looked like Indiana might lose a game that it had spent the entire night fighting to win, and the strangest character in that sequence was not Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, or even the Dream. It was the whistle. And this is where the story gets interesting. The Fever were already dealing with a game that refused to behave normally. Atlanta kept hanging around, Indiana could not completely shake them, and every time the Fever appeared ready to close the door, the Dream found another way to kick it back open. Then came the late-game officiating sequence. Suddenly, what had been a basketball game became a courtroom. Everybody watching had a different interpretation, and social media immediately went into full detective mode. Some fans were convinced Indiana was getting squeezed by the officials. Others argued that the contact was legitimate and that the referees were simply doing their job. The reason this sequence became so controversial was not simply that a whistle was blown, it was that the decision appeared to create more questions than answers. Once the play went under review, viewers naturally expected the replay to settle the argument, because that is supposed to be the entire purpose of having another look. Instead, the review seemed to make the situation even more difficult to understand, particularly for fans who believed there had not been enough contact to justify what followed. That is where the frustration really began. If officials are going to stop the game, examine the footage from multiple angles, and then change or confirm a call in a critical moment. The explanation should be clear enough that viewers understand exactly what happened. Instead, many people were left wondering what the referees had actually seen and, more importantly, what action they believed justified the decision. That does not automatically prove that the officials were trying to help Atlanta beat Indiana. And it would be irresponsible to present an accusation of intentional manipulation as an established fact without evidence. There is a major difference between a bad call, an inconsistent call, and a deliberate attempt to influence the result. Those distinctions matter, especially when the accusation involves professional referees and the integrity of a league. However, questioning the decision itself is completely reasonable. Fans can ask why one type of contact receives a whistle while another does not. They can question why a replay review appears to produce a result that does not match what they saw during the original play. They can also ask whether the officials applied the rule correctly and consistently when the game was hanging in the balance. None of those questions require a conspiracy theory, they require somebody to explain the decision. And considering how much attention officiating involving Caitlin Clark has already received, it was inevitable that this moment would attract even more scrutiny. Clark has been vocal about missed calls in previous games, while Indiana coach Stephanie White has also spoken about the importance of consistency from officials. That background matters because once fans begin believing that the standard is inconsistent, every questionable whistle becomes another piece of evidence in an argument that was already happening. Suddenly, one call is no longer just one call. It becomes part of a much larger conversation about whether Clark receives the same treatment as everyone else, whether the Fever are getting the same standard of officiating as their opponents, and whether the league understands just how much scrutiny its referees are now facing. The irony is that Clark did not need to dominate every possession to become the central figure in this game. She simply kept Indiana alive when the contest threatened to slip away. Clark finished with 26 points and 9 assists, while the Fever eventually survived a dramatic finish and defeated Atlanta 95-91 in overtime. That result is important because the controversial officiating sequence did not ultimately give Atlanta the victory that Indiana was fighting to prevent. But it absolutely could have changed the ending. That is the difference between a questionable call in the first quarter and a questionable call when the game is hanging by a thread. Early in a game, there is time for basketball to correct itself. A team can hit a three-pointer, force a turnover, miss a free throw, change its defensive strategy, or simply play better over the next 30 minutes. The scoreboard has plenty of time to absorb a mistake. Late in a close game, however, every possession becomes significantly more valuable. A single whistle can change who gets the ball, where the ball is inbounded, how much time remains, and whether one team has a chance to take control. When the margin is tiny, a decision that lasts only a few seconds can influence the entire ending. That is why the review deserves scrutiny, even without assuming bad intentions. The question is not whether the referees wanted Atlanta to win. There is no verified evidence establishing that. The more reasonable question is whether the officials got the decision right. If they did, then the league should be able to explain precisely why the call was correct. If they did not, then acknowledging the mistake would be far better than allowing fans to spend days creating their own explanations. Because when officials make a controversial decision and the league provides little clarity, the internet happily fills the vacuum. And the internet, as we all know, has never seen an unexplained sports controversy and thought, let us calmly wait for more information. No, the internet immediately becomes a detective agency with Wi-Fi. Suddenly, fans are slowing down replays frame by frame, drawing imaginary circles around players, analyzing body positioning, comparing previous calls, and building entire theories from 3 seconds of basketball. That is why transparency matters. The WNBA cannot control what every fan believes, but it can make sure the rules and review process are understandable. If the officials determine that contact meets the standard for a foul, fans should be able to understand what contact triggered that decision. If the review changes the original ruling, the league should be able to explain what the replay revealed that officials did not see initially. That explanation becomes even more important when the broadcast team itself appears surprised by the decision. The commentators are watching the same replay that the audience is watching. They are analyzing the same angles, seeing the same players, and trying to interpret the same sequence in real time. When their reaction suggests uncertainty, viewers naturally become even more curious about what the officials saw. That does not mean commentators are automatically correct. It simply means the league has a communication challenge when the people watching cannot immediately understand why the final ruling was made. And this is not an argument that Caitlin Clark should receive special treatment. That would be completely ridiculous. Clark is a professional basketball player, not a referee-proof celebrity. She is going to commit fouls, miss shots, turn the ball over, make bad decisions, and occasionally get beaten defensively. If she commits a legitimate foul, the officials should call it. The same standard has to apply to every player on the floor, because that is ultimately what fairness in officiating is supposed to mean. The issue is not whether Caitlin Clark should receive special treatment, and it certainly is not whether Angel Reese should be treated differently because of the attention surrounding her. The issue is whether the exact same rules are being applied consistently, regardless of which player is involved, which team is playing at home, or how much pressure is building as the clock winds down. That consistency becomes even more important when the two players involved are Clark and Reese, because their matchups have developed into one of the biggest storylines in women's basketball. These games no longer arrive quietly on the schedule, with nobody paying attention until the opening tip. They come with enormous expectations, massive audiences, endless social media commentary, and enough debate surrounding them to make a normal basketball game feel like a championship event. And every decision made by the officials can suddenly become part of a much larger debate about fairness, consistency, and whether both teams are being judged by the same standard. That puts an enormous responsibility on the referees. because they cannot control the attention surrounding Clark and Reese, but they can control how carefully they handle the biggest moments. When the game is close and every possession matters, officials have to understand that one questionable decision can become far more significant than the dozens of ordinary calls that nobody notices. That is exactly what happened here, because Sunday's game demonstrated how quickly a competitive basketball matchup can transform into an officiating controversy. The irony is that Atlanta had genuine opportunities to win this game without needing a controversial whistle to rescue them. The Dream were right there when the game reached its most important moments, and Angel Reese had an opportunity near the basket late in regulation that could have completely changed the ending. The shot did not fall, and when Naz Hillman followed up the miss, that attempt also failed to find the bottom of the net. Instead of Atlanta celebrating a dramatic victory, the game moved into overtime. That changed everything. The Fever suddenly had another 5 minutes to recover, regroup, and finish what they had started, and that is exactly what they did. After everything that had happened during regulation, Indiana still had to execute when the pressure was at its highest, and the Fever ultimately walked away with a 95-91 victory. That is important because no referee can actually put the ball through the basket for a team. Clark finished with 26 points and 9 assists, helping stabilize the Fever when the game became increasingly chaotic, while Reese still produced an impressive statistical performance of 15 points, 14 rebounds, and 6 assists. That means it would be unfair to reduce Reese's entire night to one missed opportunity, because basketball is not decided by one possession alone. However, one possession can become the possession everyone remembers. The WNBA should be able to determine whether the original call was correct, whether the review was conducted properly, whether the correct rule was applied, whether the resulting free throws were appropriate, and whether the officials handled the situation according to the league's established standards. If the league wants fans to trust its officiating, it cannot expect people to simply accept every controversial decision without explanation. When a replay is used to determine a crucial ruling, viewers naturally want to know what changed, what the officials saw, and why the final decision was considered correct. Otherwise, the replay can have the exact opposite effect of what it was designed to accomplish. Instead of removing doubt, it creates more of it. Instead of ending the argument, it gives the argument another 10,000 comments. And instead of making the officials appear more authoritative, it can leave fans wondering whether they are looking at the same footage. That becomes especially significant when Caitlin Clark is involved, because the level of attention surrounding her has completely changed the environment in which these games are played. But the league can make the standard clear enough that even people who disagree with a decision can understand why it was made. The WNBA has spent years building its audience, growing its stars, expanding its reach, and turning individual players into household names. Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese are major parts of that growth, and their rivalry has helped create enormous interest in women's basketball. But with that attention comes responsibility. The bigger the audience becomes, the more closely everything will be examined. The more important the games become, the more important officiating consistency becomes. And the more fans invest emotionally in the outcome, the more seriously the league has to take questions about controversial decisions. That is why this game should not simply be remembered as another Clark versus Reese matchup. It should also be remembered as another reminder that officiating has become part of the WNBA conversation, whether the league wants it to be or not. And perhaps the funniest part of the entire situation is that after all the whistles, reviews, arguments, and speculation, the Fever simply refused to cooperate with the ending some people feared. Indiana went into overtime, handled the pressure, and finished the job. Clark and her teammates survived Atlanta's final push, survived the controversy, and walked away with the victory. So the scoreboard has already delivered its answer about who won the game. The remaining question is what the officials saw during that controversial sequence and whether the WNBA believes the decision was handled correctly. That is something the league can answer. And if the league wants fans to stop playing detective every time a strange call appears on the screen, then perhaps the easiest solution is to give them the explanation they are asking for. because Indiana already settled the basketball argument on the court. Now the WNBA has an opportunity to settle the officiating argument off it.